This is Funding Talk. I'm Shane Mahabir, a decade in business funding, and this is where I talk to the people moving capital to businesses, funding, lending, fintech, and what's coming next. Today, my guest is Brooke Lynn Elzweig. She's the founder of Brackish Strategies, which is a boutique advisory firm working at the intersection of ocean, coastal, and climate infrastructure and capital markets. She comes from an environmental engineering and coastal restoration background with a master's from Duke University, and now helps growth stage companies in the blue economy raise the right kind of capital. Brooke, appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you, Shane. I'm so happy to be here. And thank you to everyone listening right now.
Glad to have you. You have a really interesting background, and we're going to get into a ton of things from what your company does, how you got into it, what the market is looking like for you now, emerging trends, your challenges, and so much more. So let's just kind of start with, what does Brackish Strategies do?
Great. Well, let's actually start with the definition of brackish. So brackish is the confluence of fresh and salt water. So it's that meeting zone where rivers enter the sea. And it's one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. And historically, brackish has had a pretty negative connotation because it means dirty water. But really, I've been wanting to give it a rebrand of it being this very productive zone where this mixing and synthesis and translation happens. And so that's what I built Brackish Strategies around. Like you said, it's a boutique strategic advisory that we sit at the intersection of ocean science, capital markets, and coastal infrastructure. Specifically, we focus on 3 different verticals, so that being coastal resilience and blue infrastructure, water systems and resource infrastructure, and also climate enabling materials such as plastic and carbon solutions.
Okay, no, that's amazing. So talk to me, how you got started on this path then. Obviously, you went to school for different things and so forth, but talk to us about that.
My path has been anything but linear. So I grew up in South Florida, directly on the coast. So I was always very intrigued by the ocean and coastal environments. But I actually went off to get my bachelor's degree in environmental engineering in Colorado. So I was in a landlocked state, very far from the ocean, and did that degree for 4 years. Once I graduated, I realized I needed to get back to my why, which has always been the ocean. So I worked in coastal restoration all over the world, from the Florida Keys to the Middle East. I was actually on a large-scale artificial reef project in Saudi Arabia. Wow. Where it was insane. And I really saw what the role of capital can do to unlock solutions at scale. And that's how I got to capital markets today.
Okay. And you decided that you wanted to be in a room full of investors and deal makers to make that happen, right? Like, this is where you are now, right? We actually connected this way in a room full of M&A folks and so forth. So how did you? Now, obviously, the business has to progress to certain things to back up what you're doing for as an advisor, end up in these rooms.
It was definitely not purposeful. Like I said, I'm an environmental engineer by training, and then I worked as a marine and a coastal scientist. What pulled me towards the business side was more frustration, honestly. I kept seeing incredible science and real working technology that just couldn't get funded because the people building it didn't speak the language investors needed to hear. So that's really what got me into the room with M&A and with private equity, is being that translator to help the scientists and the innovators connect with investors and capital allocators.
Okay. Yeah, that totally makes sense as far as them not having that background. And just like almost any transaction, whether it be personal or business, you kind of have to know the language in order to get through to them, have the best decision for your business and so forth. So talk more then about that role that financing plays for you, for your clients, and how it really, can put them on the right path or can set them back maybe.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of the companies that I've worked with in the past have been very dependent off of grants or philanthropic or federal dollars. Now, as you know, federal money has pulled back a lot. And so there is a need for private capital to really step in. The issue, though, is that a lot of these early stage startups have never worked with private capital or investors when most of their background has been in grant writing. So that's really been how I've come in, is helping to be that translation piece and to finding the right financial mechanics for a certain startup or company. So one business financing example that I've been seeing emerge recently is revenue-based financing, but it's become increasingly interesting in my space, especially for companies with contracted or recurring revenue that don't fit a traditional VC model, or they don't want to give up equity this early in their raise.
Yeah. We talk a lot about revenue-based financing, and there's a lot of different models, but yeah, it's the growth is there for the product, and that means that other people, other types of companies in your industry, and then just startups and people who have revenue, obviously. So that's amazing to hear, because the product is spreading and into your world. So is there something more specific then, or maybe talk about some of the different products that they do use? So VC, private equity money, revenue-based financing, anything else? Any other instruments?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the biggest plays right now is VC money. A lot of funds are emerging, and a lot of ocean-focused funds as well. For example, S2G Investments, based in Chicago, just raised a $1 billion fund, with oceans being a main pillar of this. Another example is Oceans 14 Capital, which is a private equity group that is focused on ocean investments. So it is emerging as a defined asset class. It's just still so niche and so nascent, but the market is starting to validate it.
And I mean, to me, it seems a little bit obvious that there needs to be more money put in. But as you mentioned, that there is a government pullback with funding. So all these other companies have to, one, kind of be aware of the need, right? And that's probably one of your things that you have to do, educate people. But the environmental changes across not just the country, but the world are happening.
Yes.
And these companies are that you're working with are helping in one way or another to maybe solve some of those problems. All right. So that leads us to kind of the blue economy, how and what it actually means to be an investable category. Talk to us about that.
That's a great question. So I'm going to start with some numbers first. If the ocean economy were a country, it would rank among one of the largest in the world. In fact, JP Morgan just estimated that the blue economy is valued at $3 trillion annually. And just think about it. I mean, the oceans are the backbone of our global economy. More than 90% of global trade moves by ships. 99% of international data runs through undersea cables. 3.3 billion people rely on seafood as a key source of protein. But regardless of, all of the economics backing the ocean, there's a massive investment gap. There's actually an estimated $175 billion financing gap for the oceans, with philanthropic funding being less than 1% and then private finance being less than 0.1%. Regardless of the fact, ocean investment has grown 7 times over the last 5 years. Even, publicly listed companies have reported that there is material risk related to the ocean. I think the number was 66% of publicly listed companies have some material risk linked to the ocean. Wow. Yeah. And so, the UNCW Blue Economy Index has been outperforming the S&P and other major indices. And so we are seeing this growing trend, and people are starting to realize that this is not, an ESG or a conservation play, but this is about hard infrastructure, and this is about creating the resilience geopolitically and economically. This is real companies with real revenue. So think, shipping and maritime industries, defense and subsea security, offshore wind development, AI infrastructure, ocean monitoring and data. So they are huge industries that span far beyond just a conservation or an environmental play.
So those are some trends and great numbers. Anything else as far as trends and the markets in the blue economy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would look more geopolitically
Yeah.
and at economic factors rather than just purely environmental. Let's take, the war in Iran, for example, and the
Yeah.
instability across that region. Water scarcity is going to be a huge underlying pressure that's going to be driving a lot of instability across that region and beyond. So, looking at water and resource infrastructure is going to be a huge trend. So is energy. As we move away from fossil fuels and limited resources, we need to look at offshore renewables and other regenerative industries. AI and data is obviously huge, but nobody is connecting this to the blue economy yet. But as you know, AI data centers are a huge water waste. And
Hmm.
if we could maybe leverage the ocean in some way, that could be a huge win for both AIs and offshore data centers, as well as, for the ocean in general. And then lastly, too, is coastal resilience and aging infrastructure. I mean, all of our infrastructure was built decades ago, and especially infrastructure that is on the coastline is so susceptible to erosion and rising sea level. And so we're going to need smarter, stronger infrastructure.
And is there anything right now as far as using the ocean that is already a possibility if they're whether they're coast close to a coastline or not?
I would say yes, there's
Okay.
definitely momentum building in this space, and we're already seeing startups take on this trend. There's this one
Okay.
startup in particular, they're called Panthalassa. I might have butchered their name, but they raised $140 million
Wow.
for a wave powered AI data center infrastructure. So it's definitely happening. There is
Okay.
another startup called Magrathea that raised $100 million from investors, and they're producing magnesium and rare earth metals from the brine discharge from desalination plants. And so there is certainly money moving in the space. There's other startups that are doing autonomous sail systems or nuclear reactors or, uncrewed surface vessels collecting ocean data for offshore mapping. So yeah,
Okay.
definitely a lot of momentum in the space.
Okay. Yeah, and data centers are just continuing to grow or to be built
Yeah.
or to try to get approvals. And then you mentioned the war in Iran. There's rumor of desalination plants being destroyed and so forth. So there's a lot of things happening, and that obviously it doesn't just affect maybe that one country or the immediate area. It does have a ripple effect, right?
Oh my God, completely. And
Yeah.
desalination is such a great example of that because, 300 million people are supplied with fresh water from desalination in arid regions. So, if a desal plant is getting knocked out, we lose, 50 to 75% of a country's fresh water supply.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I know. Insane.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's okay. You can kind of cope with
Mm.
Mother Nature doing certain things, but when it's man-made problems creating, right, the issues, it's a little bit tougher to swallow, and it's profitable for some other people for some other industries, unfortunately.
I think, and this might take us into a totally different subject, but
Yeah.
I think, the ocean and the environmental movement has gotten it, historically wrong about our narrative, where of course we want to preach the importance of protecting our environment, but to investors and capital allocators, we have to speak the language of finance and seeing what those returns actually are. And then we have to talk about geopolitical risk and our own security as a nation. And so that's where the ocean comes in. Yes, I want the ocean to thrive and be sustainable and to be healthy, but also there is so much return and investment that's so underutilized right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of my questions was going to be your challenges, and it sounds like we already summed up quite a few of them. Anything else as far as challenges go, for you or your clients?
Yeah. For me, and I think, a lot of people in my industry might relate to this, is that one of the hardest things is still proving that the room exists.
Mm.
Even being at that M&A networking session a few weeks ago, a lot of people look at me of being like, why are you a marine biologist in a room of, M&A and private equity folks?
Yeah.
And I think it's still trying to prove that thesis and that narrative and that link back to the oceans. And also, as we spoke about, the blue economy still isn't fully institutionalized as an investment category yet. So part of what I struggle with and is a challenge is building the credibility in a space that's still being defined.
Okay.
And so yeah, it's me really having to be careful and precise about that narrative and tracing it back to the ocean, and also making sure that every engagement that I work with is reinforcing that thesis rather than diluting it.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. It sounds like to build that awareness, to educate people, and then to get through all the different, challenges along the way as far as the geopolitical and things that you mentioned. I admire you for putting in that work though, and building something. Any other, we talked about regulation or at least government intervention, essentially. Are there specific things that are maybe not that have already passed, but that are either now kind of being, drawn, or that you can see being a positive regulation, or the
Yeah.
opposite?
Actually, yes. In the past, I would have said that permitting is a killer because of slow regulatory timelines and dealing with so many different stakeholders from, the Army Corps of Engineers to the EPA to state coastal commissions. But I'm actually seeing that changing, especially in our, backyard of South Florida. I want to take one company, for example. They're
Hmm.
called Kind Designs, and they were first started in Miami. They just closed a $10 million pre-Series A to massively scale 3D printed living seawalls across Miami and beyond. Insane. They have $175 million of contracted work in their pipeline right now, and they just closed a $2 million contract with the US Navy. And the reason why they're able to be so successful right now is because Miami-Dade and local cities are starting to rewrite their codes to provide building permit discounts and mitigation exemptions. Governor Ron DeSantis actually signed a bill, it's SB 302, to incentivize 3D printed living seawalls across the state. So there are good things happening in this space, and
Hmm.
the federal government is doing work to help streamline and optimize permitting, which is really going to help coastal and marine projects.
That's really a good story. I mean, 3D printing has been around for a little while, doing some different things, and then now, maybe in the last year or two, I see it almost building houses and so forth. And now, this is a really good example of how it could be useful, and much of South Florida needs that, right? So,
Yeah,
to
it's going to be a
protect.
huge industry.
Yeah. And by the way, for people who aren't from South Florida, me and you are both from here
Mm.
originally, which is very rare. Like walking around or just
I
out and about,
know.
you're not going to meet too many people that are born and raised in South Florida. So, yeah.
I know we're competing with all the New Yorkers now.
Yeah. Yeah. True. True. So, talk to me about then your perfect client, right? So you're fully, booked, but you can take on more clients. Who are the people that you can actually help?
I can take on more clients, and I call them the growth stage sweet spot. So this is a company that's in that $5 to $50 million range, that's gotten past the grant phase, has real revenue or a contracted pipeline, but needs help telling their story to growth capital or strategic partners. These are usually founded by scientists or engineers who are brilliant, but they don't have the language to speak to investors. Beyond growth stage companies, I also would love to work with investors and capital partners, funds that are trying to source the right startups to invest in. Also, mission-driven organizations who also need help with their narrative or funding pathways. And so I take on lots of different clients as long as they are in the blue and the brackish economy in some way.
And with you starting your own thing, like what's something that you would let people know about starting their own venture now that you've been on this path for a little while? What would you say?
I would say build your own category instead of trying to fit into someone else's. I built Brackish because I was tired of waiting for the opportunities to come and realized I just needed to create it on my own. But look, my path has been hard to define because I'm not a traditional consultant. I'm not a traditional engineer. I'm not even a traditional marine biologist. I'm something in between. And I actually think that multidisciplinarity has been my differentiator. And the discomfort of being undefined is very real, but very valuable. And so for what I'd say to someone wanting to start their own venture
Right.
is to sit in the discomfort of it and build your own category as opposed to waiting for the market to validate it.
Great advice. Kind of, being comfortable with being uncomfortable I think that's the saying.
1,000%.
There's challenges along the way. I started my own thing and that was kind of it. It's not, one path that you have to follow. Create your own, make your own thing, and be ready to, bust your butt.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, totally.
Anything else you want to tell potential investors, potential clients, anything else?
I would say to investors that there is a very real untapped opportunity here, especially for private equity. There has been a lot of movement now with VC firms, but I've still yet to see a lot of private equity presence in these ocean and coastal industries. I'm seeing it with water infrastructure and circularity, but private equity has a really big opportunity to enter in this space and to make big returns. And then for clients, I'm very bespoke, so really able to offer a lot of different services to a lot of different clients. I could help with narrative and positioning. I could help with investor relations, with funding strategy, everything, with event coordination, whatever you need. And so if you think that I can help you, don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay. Great stuff, Brooke. I appreciate you taking the time today. So people, if you're watching, get a hold of Brooke. I'm going to leave your contact information, of course. But again, appreciate you, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, Shane. This was great.
Thank you.